Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is 𝗂𝗲𝗃𝗍, and as Chair of the RDS Foundation Board, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the latest webinar in the RDS Climate Smart Agriculture series. This series addresses the main factors influencing the sustainable development of agriculture in Ireland and assesses how to marry our climate responsibilities with future agricultural policy. Today's event is organised in partnership with the EPA and the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, funded SeQUEsTER project, which has employed a backcasting modelling approach to generate indicative scenarios of climate-neutral agricultural activities and land use from 2050 out to 2120. As many of you know, Ireland is committed to be a climate-neutral economy by 2050. That requires near-complete decarbonisation of energy, transport, industrial and construction sectors. However, it will not be possible to achieve the same level of decarbonisation in biological systems of food production, and the land sector will be required to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere for storage in soils, biomass and wood products. What we hope to achieve today is to present a vision for what a climate-neutral agriculture system in Ireland could look like and how to achieve it. We're delighted to welcome journalist and broadcaster 𝗲𝗂𝗁 to host today's discussions. On behalf of the RDS, I would like to thank all involved in making today's event possible. I would especially like to thank Dr. David Stiles, University of Galway, Professor Mary Ryan of 𝗏𝗂𝗃, and Mary Donnelly, Chair of the Climate Change Advisory Council, for their contribution to this important and timely discussion. I would now like to hand over to our host for this afternoon, 𝗲𝗂𝗁. Thank you.
Thank you, 𝗂𝗲𝗁, and thank you all for joining us for this latest event in the RDS Climate Smart Agriculture series. We've got some really fascinating presentations lined up for you, and we're also asking you to take part in the discussion too. We have a series of questions for you throughout this event. We'd like you to take the time to consider them properly and answer them as honestly as you can, so that we can get a proper overview about how you feel about the future of agriculture in Ireland. The questions will be put to you through Slido polls, and you'll be answering all of them anonymously. So I think we'll get straight into it, and we're going to present to you the first question, the first poll in today's event. It's a straightforward one. We're simply asking you, what is your background? Are you a farmer, academic researcher? Do you work in industry? Are you a policymaker or other? So we'll ask you to answer those questions now, and we'll just to give us a feel of who our audience is and what you're made up of. So it looks, I suppose, fairly evenly divided. We'll give you another couple of seconds to answer that. So really quite evenly divided between academic researchers, industry, policymakers, and others. There we go, 33%, around 30%. It's changing all the time, but just to give you an idea of who's tuning in. And we will be asking you throughout the event to take part in the Slido polls and answer the questions live. You can only really answer them while the questions are up on screen. So there you go, that's who's tuning in. We have one more question for you. I think we'll go to that now before we go to our presentation. We're asking you to consider a statement. So the statement we're putting to you is: Ireland must achieve climate neutrality by 2050 to tackle the climate emergency. How do you feel about that statement? Do you strongly agree? Do you somewhat agree? Do you somewhat disagree? Or do you strongly disagree? And I think it's quite unanimous. Strongly agree, 100% of you agree that Ireland must achieve climate neutrality by 2050 to tackle the climate emergency. So there you go. We will have more questions for you as we move on through the event. But now it's time for our keynote address. And I'd like to introduce Mary Donnelly, Chairperson of the Climate Change Advisory Council.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity of having a conversation with you today about agriculture, climate change, and indeed the future that we can all look forward to. Agriculture and the actions that will take place in agriculture over the next number of weeks, months, years, and even decades will impact directly the kind of world that we will live in into the future, not just for ourselves, of course, but for our children and for their children and beyond. So now is a key moment in time in terms of the action that we're going to take. And in that context, it's probably useful to just consider where we're starting from. So the good news is that Ireland has a very high level of ambition in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions between now and 2030. At a 51% reduction, we would be on track to meet the Paris goals, and indeed we would be one of the highest levels of ambition of any country in the world. That's the good news. We also have put in place a structure around how we're going to achieve that in terms of establishing 2 5-year budgets for this decade and a provisional one for the first half of the next decade, by establishing during the summer this year the sectoral targets for each of the sectors, although land use is yet to follow, and to start the process of annual climate action plans that will set out the policies and the measures that we will use to achieve our goals. All of that is very positive, and indeed it's a very good start. But I think we do have to pause for a moment and consider our starting point and understand the difficulty of the challenge that we are facing. So for this carbon budget exercise and this emission reductions that we're talking about, we have taken 2018 as our base year. And the agricultural sector in that year represented 34% of our emissions. Indeed, if I was to add to that the share coming from land use and land use change, that is an additional 11%. So combined, agriculture and land use, what we will call in the future the AFLU sector, represents 45% of our emissions here in Ireland. So it's clear that this is a really steep challenge that we have before us in terms of taking the measures and the actions necessary to reduce our emissions. But let's look at agriculture first. In agriculture, of course, the main emissions that we are looking at are nitrous oxide and methane. At 34% of emissions in 2018, that was about 23 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. The sector has a target of reducing that by 25%, which means a reduction of somewhere between 5 and 6 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent in the next 10 years. Hopefully front-ended, of course, because we need the actions to take impactful effect as quickly as possible. So what are the issues that are facing agriculture in the short term? Well, the measures that are being looked at, of course, are looking firstly at nitrous oxide, and that's, of course, in the area of fertilizer use. As you've seen from a lot of the media and the studies that have been done, including some of the food vision groups that have been set up by the minister, you can see that the targeted reduction of fertilizer use in Ireland is about a reduction of 25%. But not just a reduction of 25%, it's also a shift in use away from fertilizers such as CAN into protected urea. And remember that protected urea has a 5-fold saving of greenhouse gas emissions. So a very important shift in terms of the practice of fertilizer use in the country. Combining these two will deliver almost half of the 25% reduction that we're looking for in this decade. And the important part of this is that it makes commercial sense for farmers to do this. It makes sense, for example, because firstly, we all know that nitrous oxide is a potent greenhouse gas emitter. Fertilizers cost money, and in the current environment, we are aware of supply chain difficulties. So that's a challenge for farmers. We're also looking at very substantial increase in costs of fertilizer. So the question is, can we reduce our fertilizer use without adversely affecting our farmer practice? And the answer, of course, to that is yes. Combine that with the absolute necessity of looking at our runoffs into our rivers and our lakes and our streams, which, as you know, has been a problem over the last number of years. So combining the improvements there foreseen, for example, under the Nitrates Directive, means that we can benefit not only in terms of the climate, but also in terms of the water, the atmosphere, the air that we breathe, but also ultimately farmers' pockets. For example, protected urea, certainly up until now, has been no more expensive. So it's actually a cheaper option with a much better impact on the climate than non-protected urea. So the key issue that we're looking at here is to look at the balance of costs and rewards for farmers for the practice that they use at the moment. Yes, commodity prices are high, but input costs are high and increasing at a faster rate. So preserving the margin, the income for farmers, is a key issue. And this is an area where the two objectives of income protection and ultimately climate change can work together for the benefit of all actors concerned. So our number one priority in this context is looking at the nitrous oxide through the fertilizer use and reducing it. Challenge, of course, is awareness raising and deployment, rolling it out across all farmers across the country as quickly as possible, achievable in a short time, because of course, in this context, you're talking about an annual cycle of farming. And to do that in the short term brings really positive results, both for farmers, as I say, and for the climate. Accompanying that, of course, are farming practices that will be modernized and introduced and rolled out as well. Things like low emission slurry spreading, mixed sward planting, liming our land, for example, to improve both the performance of the land, the quality of the product that's coming from the land, and also to reduce our emissions. So those farming practices, we've been talking about them for quite a bit of time now. These also will assist in terms of reducing the nitrous oxide. And as we all know, nitrous oxide is a particularly potent greenhouse gas as such, with a multiplying factor of 28 times CO2 itself. So big area there, big challenge for us to look at that and to get that one right. All of the economics, all of the research, the science points to that as an important solution, an opportunity that exists, and one that we need to move on as quickly as possible. Of course, we also have to think about the other greenhouse gas emission coming out of agriculture, which is, of course, methane. Clearly, in the area of methane, we are looking at best, the status quo vis-a-vis emission reduction. The emissions we had in 2018, they're still there in 2019, in 2020, in 2021, and they're likely to be there in 2022. We have a real challenge in this context. Our cattle herd in this country is undergoing a shift. We can see that from the numbers coming from the CSO. When we look at the beef cow numbers, they are in a gradual decline, they are being adjusted, but the numbers in the dairy herd are continuing to increase. And as we know, dairy cows emit more per capita than beef cows. And that means that our emission profile from our cattle is continuing to stay high in an unadjusted way. So our real challenge is to try and move that forward in a way that allows the emissions to start being reduced. Clearly, the more we do in the first part on nitrous oxide, the easier it will be in the methane side. But we cannot avoid changes in the methane area. And in this context, of course, we're looking at genetics, at improving the profile of production of our animals to improve the outputs, the efficiency of their operation. We're also looking at, for example, the age of slaughter for some of the beef herd and moving that one forward. And we're looking at, and this is perhaps the most important area, additional income sources for farmers who choose perhaps to diversify into new areas. And the kinds of areas that we're looking at would include, for example, things like organic farming. And it's not just organic farming of plants, although obviously plants, and particularly plant protein, is a key opportunity and a key market growth internationally. So it is an opportunity for farmers to go into that space, but also organic farming of animals. As we move forward, the market will start to shift and demand and pay a premium for organic beef, organic dairy products. And that's an opportunity for our farmers to move into as soon as possible. Another area, of course, is in the whole forestry space. And I'll come to that in a moment as to the issues that we have facing us in our land use section. And of course, a third area for additional income sources for farmers comes in the area of energy. We've seen it very prevalently at the moment with the Ukraine war, with the consequential impact on gas prices, the threat to security of supply, certainly the cost increases, both for gas and electricity, the concerns that we have with the prices of diesel and petrol and home heating oil. It puts into perspective the importance of energy within our society. And this is an additional income stream available for farmers to produce energy in the form of biomass, for example, in the form of solar power, in the form of wind power. So these additional opportunities for income generation for farming are very important. They're important for society, but they're also important for the farming community because they represent a real opportunity for diversification of their commercial operations. And of course, we cannot forget the opportunities that are available to us from research and development. And in that context, we rely on 𝗬𝗏𝘃 for the new innovations that are coming down the track, the new opportunities that will present themselves, the new products indeed that we can use, including methane reduction inhibitors that are currently being developed. Are they applicable in the Irish context? If so, how best can it be done? Clearly, this is urgent research that we need to do and we need to make available to farmers as soon as it has been validated. So out of that, you can see that we have a very real challenge in reducing emissions in the agricultural sector, 5 to 6 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. It's not going to be easy, but it is achievable. We actually have the technologies and the pathways available to us today. The challenge that we have is awareness raising, knowledge transfer, support for farmers, and then implementation at the farm level across all of the country. I mentioned that I would come back to the issue of forestry because, of course, it's also a very important area. And in this context, Ireland is a significant outlier vis-a-vis the rest of Europe. By the way, we are also in agriculture because in Ireland, we have a lot more cattle than we have people, and we don't have as much heavy industry as, for example, other countries in Europe have. But in the forestry area, we're also an outlier in that our land is actually a source of emissions. In most countries in Europe, the land is a sink. It absorbs emissions, mainly because of their forest cover. In Ireland, I suppose the good news is, in 1900, 1% of our land was covered by trees. Today, it's closer to 11. But over the last 20 years, the plantation rate has really fallen off a cliff. And it means that we are now seriously exposed with our land becoming a source of emissions instead of being a sink. And this is something that we really need to reverse. Key issues in this context, obviously, are peatlands, a major source of emissions at the moment, and re-wetting the bogs is a serious challenge. It's one that we can do and we will do as soon as possible. It will contribute to removing those emissions. A second one is developing our forests and rolling out our forest structure in a managed way across the country. In that context, the most recent emission from the government in terms of, was it 1.3 billion euros funding to support this whole process, as well as adjustments of the structure of that support, is very important. The idea of moving for funding from 15 years to 20 years makes a lot of sense and gives, investors and farmers much greater support over the lifetime of the development of the forest. Equally, the rollout of supports, even for small stands at 1 hectare with reduced licensing requirements, very important in terms of starting the process of getting forestry accepted, getting the notion of forestry as understood as part and parcel of farming. And indeed, that's arguably one of the biggest problems that we have, in that attitudinally, unfortunately, forestry is not really considered to be farming. In other countries, it's not only just farming, it's intrinsic to the community. I visited a forest stand in Finland with the family that owned it, and the grandparents were there, the father and mother were there, the kids were there. They all went to clean out the forest stand, take away the thinnings, and then they had a big picnic. And they do this twice a year. And it's part and parcel of their culture to see the forest as an integral part of their community. Equally, the forest is a supplier of support and biomass into their district heating system, which keeps them warm in the winter. So the integrated nature of forest into the community and into society is part and parcel of the way they operate. And it's an opportunity, I believe, for Ireland to start looking at how forests can be used as an integral part and a support for society and communities locally. And that's before we even get to the stage of looking how it can support other parts of our economy. We currently have a housing shortage. We are in a situation where in Ireland, on average, we have 24% of our houses that are timber framed. In Scotland, for example, that number is 75%. And as you know, you'll build a timber frame house for less and faster if you use the proper methodology. So the opportunity really exists in a commercial sense to use our forests for our own social needs, construction, obviously district heating systems as we roll them out across society and communities in Ireland, and biomass in the energy space. Without damaging the main trunk of the tree, we can support a biomass industry, be it used for heating or indeed potentially also for transport. Going forward, it's absolutely essential that we make progress in this area, and over the next number of years, that we can move from a situation where our land is a source of emissions to at least being neutral, balanced, and perhaps over time ultimately becomes a sink. We wonder what it's going to be like to be net neutral. The reality is that we will still have emissions in 2050, 2070, beyond. It's normal. We will have, the land itself will continue to breathe and will emit. And ultimately, we have to have sources and sinks that will absorb those emissions in, for example, our forest. So the role that the forest plays in terms of our longer term stability and societal balance is hugely important. So I think from this you can see that as we look at agriculture and the practices in agriculture, the opportunity exists for really good, commercially hard-nosed, common sense decisions on investment, reduced investment indeed, on fertilizer use, moving into sustainably producing the products that we produce out of our land and maximizing the quality and the value of those in our home market and indeed in our export markets. Accompanying that then, we need to have the balance of the forests, which will act as a sink and a balancing to whatever emissions remains as we go forward into a net neutral zero zone. In that context, I hope you can see agriculture is key. It's fundamental to our success. The support of farmers and the rural community is integral to the achievement of our ambitions. And I look forward, as indeed do my colleagues in the Council, to continuing to work with the agricultural sector and to working with farmers, their partners, their wives, their families and communities in terms of delivering the best results that leads to the kind of society and community that we all want to have into the future. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you, Mary. That was Ms Donnelly, Chairperson of the Climate Change Advisory Council. Now, before we move on to our next presentation, we have two more polls for you. They're on Slido, and we would ask you to answer them as they appear. So the first statement we are giving you, and we're asking you to consider this statement: failure to meet climate targets is likely to undermine green marketing of Ireland's agri-food exports. How do you feel about that statement? Do you strongly agree? Do you somewhat agree? Do you somewhat disagree? Or do you strongly disagree? Failure to meet climate targets is likely to undermine green marketing of Ireland's agri-food exports. So let us know how you feel. Strongly agree, somewhat disagree, or strongly disagree. And we can see the votes coming in. It's changing slightly, but again, it's quite unanimous. At the moment, over 80%, 86, 87% of you strongly agree with that statement, and the rest of you somewhat agree with it. Nobody disagrees. Failure to meet climate targets is likely to undermine green marketing of Ireland's agri-food exports. So there you go. That's one of the questions we're putting to you now. And we have one more before we move on to our next presentations. We have another statement that we'd like you to consider. What we're asking you now: diversification is necessary to improve the resilience and sustainability of Ireland's agricultural sector. Again, let us know now what you think of that statement. Do you strongly agree with it? Do you somewhat agree with it? Do you somewhat disagree with it? Or do you strongly disagree with it? Diversification is necessary to improve the resilience and the sustainability of Ireland's agricultural sector. So what are your opinions on diversification? And again, we can see the results coming in. The vast majority, over 80% at the moment, 83% of you strongly agree that diversification is necessary. And 19% of you somewhat agree with it. So there you go. That is the latest poll. Again, nobody present disagrees with that statement that diversification is necessary to improve the resilience and sustainability of Ireland's agricultural sector. So thank you very much. We will have more polls for you as we continue on throughout the event, and we really do appreciate you taking the time to answer them. Now it's time for the next presentation. We're going to be looking at the economic implications of climate neutrality, and we're joined again by Professor 𝗂𝗵𝗿𝗄𝗃, Established Chair, Social and Public Policy at the University of Galway. And 𝗂𝗵𝗃 was also head of Teagasc Rural Economy and Development Programme for over a decade.
Thanks, Helen. And I'm going to present some work today on some of the economic analysis that's fed into the Department of Ag and EPA-funded SeQUEsTER project. I'm going to start with these lines, which essentially describe the number of animal numbers and cattle over the last century. It's part of a history of Irish agriculture that I presented earlier in the year. The top line, with the numbers on the right of the graphic, represent the total number of cattle. And the bottom two lines, the red line, are dairy cattle, and the orange line are other cows. Dairy cows, there is a red line. So it started off around 4 million cattle back in the 20s. Didn't grow that much until the 50s. And then as the first subsidies came in the early 1960s, and as we anticipated joining the European Economic Community in the 70s, there was a strong increase in overall cattle numbers, particularly driven by the dairy sector. Historically, there were more dairy cows than suckler cows, and that ratio rose as we joined the EC with the anticipation of a free trade in dairy products. Once we joined the EC, there was a cattle crisis, and there was a fall off in numbers almost immediately, and then in total cattle. And then we had milk quota in 1984, which limited milk production, from which we saw a decline in the number of dairy cows. In parallel, there was the start of headage payments for suckler cattle. And into the 90s, we had the McSharry reforms, which drove on the total number of cattle up to a peak in 1998. And that was the highest number of cattle we ever had in the country. During that period, we saw the number of dairy cows and suckler cows converge to be about the same, of about 1 million. And that remained the case for the bones of a decade and a half. Into the 2005, there was decoupling. We saw a decline in numbers over the period since 1998 to a low point in 2011 after the financial crisis. And with the cap health check and the loosening of milk quota and then its abolition in 2015, we saw a rapid takeoff in the dairy sector and a gradual decline in the number of suckler cows. And so it meant that our numbers of cattle are growing back up to the maximum number that we ever had, but it's not quite as high as 1998. This graphic is the number of cattle aged under 1, with the lighter green male and the darker green female going back over the last 40 years. And one of the challenges in reaching the target for 2030 is that the number of, potentially breeding animals, the female calves, is growing, is continuing to grow, and it's now more than at any point in the past, including the previous peak. The progeny of these animals will still be around in 2030, and so one of the challenges in making some of the climate action targets is that continued animal growth. 𝗂𝗵𝘁 have prepared a roadmap they published in 2019, which classified a whole range of different mechanisms by which we could reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the agricultural sector. It's really a very important piece of work. And they classified measures into 4 potential sources of savings. The first, land use, for example, things like forestry, accounted for 45% of the potential reductions, and we'll come back to that in a later presentation. Energy in farms, such as bioenergy and so on, would account for 27%. The challenge with that under the current accounting rules is that savings made by farms in this area aren't counted as part of emissions within the sector. And it's important to recognize that agriculture delivers more than food, fiber, fuel, and feed. And so I think it's essential, if we want farmers to deliver on greenhouse gas emission reductions, that we find a way to measure and count everything that agriculture does. The other 2 areas fall within the area of agriculture, what are called agricultural technical measures. So things like improved fertilizer formulation, like protected urea, different feeds, the way we spread slurry, that can reduce the amount of emissions for doing the same thing, for having the same number of animals. That reduces about 17.5%. And the last area is known as efficiency. So these include things like animal breeding. Improved animal breeding means that you can produce the same amount of food with fewer animals. But that's a very important point. It's the same amount of food, but not necessarily the same amount of animals. And sometimes that's missed in public debate. Colleagues of mine in 𝗂𝗵𝘁 and in the University of Galway have undertaken a study looking at emissions over time in the agricultural sector. The red line, sorry, the blue line is the amount of animal emissions per unit of product. It's fallen over time as the efficiency of agriculture has improved, the carbon efficiency. So fewer emissions for the produce we produce. So that's a good trend. That's something we need to deliver on. And it's the focus of a lot of scientific investment by 𝗂𝗵𝘁 and in their extension activities. But the challenge is that the red line is going up, the amount of emissions from the sector. So that the increase in animal numbers is growing at a faster rate than we're improving the environmental efficiency of the sector. And that is a challenge in realizing the objectives we set ourselves in terms of reduced emissions. As an economist, more efficiency means that you get a higher return per animal, which from my perspective, particularly for the dairy sector, would mean a pressure to have more animals. If you could make more per animal, you will supply more animals, you will have more animals. So the question I would ask is that even if we can deliver lower emissions with the same amount of food, do we have the levers to realize those gains from efficiency? 𝗀𝗵𝗿𝗄 and the Food Wise 2030 Committee for Dairy proposed a retirement scheme that might enable that, and a number of other measures. But we still have work to do in relation to doing this. In terms of comparing ourselves with other countries, we have a relatively efficient dairy sector, amongst the lowest emissions in Europe. However, when you look at things in a different way, if you look at the different sectors in Ireland, we see that, and in other countries as well, that the emissions are higher for methane emitting sectors like dairy, sheep and beef relative to other sectors like poultry, fish and pigs and so on. So there are quite different emissions per product for different sectors. I did a study looking at the food harvest strategy in 2020. And the straight line is our target. And the individual lines are the progress towards the target. So with the top line, which is beef, we achieved that target early. The next line, the light green line, is milk. We achieved that early and exceeded both. But in the sectors which have lower emissions, like agriculture, we never hit the target. And for forestry, where we sequester carbon, we only once reached 50% of the target. So we were successful in delivering on the low carbon footprint, but not in the carbon sequestration. If we look to the past to see how do we farm in the past, this graphic describes the share of cattle, dairy, sheep, other animals and cereals. And up to the 50s, about 50% of our output came from sectors that didn't produce methane, that had lower emissions. That's grown to 75% today. So pigs, poultry and cereals are more important in the past. And the question I would ask is, do we want a different mix? Should that be part of the solution, that diversification point of view that we heard in the Slido poll? And one of the implications of that balance, that our focus on food production that is based upon ruminant animals that produce methane, is that when we look at the overall system, this graphic describes the agricultural productivity in the EU, so the euro of output per carbon production, and we have the highest carbon per unit output across the EU. My last two slides now look firstly upon the notion of farm viability and the question about a just transition. We've had very substantial growth since 2015 in the sector. Viability has declined of the whole overall sector. The dairy sector has much higher viability, but we see a worsening viability in the beef sector. So essentially, the gains we see for the sector as a whole have not been spread evenly across the sector. They've been primarily concentrated within the dairy sector. A question we have for policy is, how do we deliver economic gains from dairy while preserving the viability of the wider sector? How do we deliver that just transition? And again, there are some examples from 𝗀𝗵𝗺𝗁 group and from 𝗀𝗵𝘁, things like emissions trading, from beef to allow for dairy expand and potentially find a win-win. So to conclude and to summarize, we see that improved carbon efficiency, and there are further opportunities that 𝗀𝗵𝘁 and researchers are working on to improve the efficiency of the sector. However, the growth in animal numbers are coming faster than this efficiency growth. Do we have the levers to manage that and to deliver on the efficiency gains? And instead of focusing purely on animal changes, should we think of diversifying and learning lessons from the past? And finally, can we use novel instruments like emissions trading to facilitate just transitions and a more balanced benefit and cost across the sector? Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Cathal. Now we have two more polls for you. These ones are a little bit more detailed, so we will ask you to take the time to consider the questions properly, and we will give you a little bit more time for these polls. So we'll take a look at the first of them. What we're asking you to do here is to select your preferred option from 4 possible ones. So we're asking you to select your preferred option for climate neutral combinations, and we'll go through the options. The first one is a low to modest rate of afforestation with a low to modest rate of organic soil rewetting, a much lower milk production and much lower beef production. So if that's the option you would prefer, we'll ask you to choose that one. Option number 2 is a high rate of afforestation with a high rate of organic soil rewetting, a modestly lower milk production, and a modestly lower beef production. That's option 2. The next one is a high rate of afforestation with a high rate of organic soil rewetting, a similar milk production rate, and a much lower beef production. That's option number 3. And option number 4 is a high rate of afforestation with a high rate of organic soil rewetting, with similar beef production this time, and a much lower milk production. So we're asking you to choose just one option. We'll keep them up for a little bit longer to give you time to consider it and vote on it. And these results, again, we're looking at them live coming in, but they will be available to you all later when the report is issued. So there are 4 options. Consider each option and choose your one preferred option. So we can see the figures going up and down, but at the moment, almost half of you, your preferred option is a high rate of afforestation with a high rate of organic soil rewetting, modestly lower milk production, and modestly lower beef production. That seems to be the preferred option. And then coming in second is high rate of afforestation, high rate of organic soil rewetting, similar milk production, and much lower beef production. So there you go, your 4 possible climate neutral combinations, and you can see there with Slido what the preferred options are. Okay, I think most of you have selected your option. So I think now we may move on to our next poll. And again, just to reiterate, all of these final results will be available to you later when the report is issued. So again, this is a slightly detailed one. We're asking you here to rank options in order of preference. So what we're asking you is, how would you rank priorities for meeting climate neutrality? And we're asking you to rank from number 1, the most important one, to number 10. Now you can scroll through. If they don't all appear on your screen, you can scroll down. There are 10 options, and we are asking you to rank them in order of importance. We'll go through those options. To implement technical mitigation options, to improve cattle genetics, to plant new native forests, to plant new commercial conifer forests, re-wet organic soils, expand high nature value grassland management, essentially low stocking rates, diversify the use of grass as a bioeconomy feedstock, move towards more diversified mixed farming systems and alternative livestock mix, prioritize dairy production and reduce suckler beef production, and then organic farming. So what you do is drag your preferred option to the top. There are 10 options there. We are asking you to rank all of them in order of importance from number 1, the most important, down to number 10. So you can select the options, drag them up, and place them in order of importance. There are a lot of options there. We will give you the time to answer them. If you can take a look from 1 to 10, rank them in order of importance. And just to let you know, because there's quite a lot to this, we will come back and take a look at the results of this poll. So from 1 to 10, drag, place them in order of importance from your most preferred option down to number 10. And that will be left up for a few minutes as well as we go into our next presentation. So when we move on from the Slido poll, it's not dead, it's still there, you can still vote on it. Our next presentation now is on forestry. It's by Professor Mary Ryan from Teagasc, who's a researcher in environmental economics and the Rural Development Programme Coordinator. Unfortunately, Mary can't be with us today, so we're rejoined by the busiest man in the RDS. I'm going to ask Professor 𝗂𝗏𝗄𝗏, who will give Mary's presentation on her behalf.
Thanks, Helen. And I'm going to present work that I've worked with Mary for about 15 years in relation to forestry. And we've had very many funded projects and PhD students over the years in this space. And I also personally published a synthesis report on some of the recommendations from our program over the summer. And I will reference some of the recommendations from that over the course of the presentation. So as context, this is a graphic that's often presented at forestry events, which is the annual planting rate in terms of hectares over the last century. It was relatively small up to the 50s. Then as we had the Whitaker report, it grew flat. It peaked in the 90s and has gradually declined over the last 20 years or so to a relatively low amount at the moment, about 2,000 hectares, which is about 8% from the peak in 1995. There's a lot of discussion around the forestry sector at the moment, and there's a new strategy and a new grants program, which is welcome, with very significant increases in budget. So it's great to see that perspective at government level. But when I look at the sector over a century, I see a success story. We had 1% of our land area in 1922, and now we have 11%. It's the biggest land use change since foundation of the state, and it's now twice the area of crops, fruit, and horticulture. So to make that amount of change is very significant. And as we look at, we're at crossroads now in terms of where we want to go, that we can again look backwards to go forwards. The economic proposition of planting forestry is good. This graphic is from some work we did using the Teagasc National Farm Survey, which basically finds that more than half and up to 70 or 80% of beef and sheep farmers will be better off with forestry. Now we see a fall off in planting rates at the moment, and so there are wider behavioural challenges, particularly things like the replanting obligation. Something else that we find when we look at people who actually planted, it's not just a straight forestry land use change, but rather farmers do other things when they plant forestry. They look at forestry as part of an early retirement or a gradual retirement strategy, or for another proportion, they look at it as part of as a diversification strategy. Forestry maybe increase their stocking rate and maybe have off-farm jobs or other things. A multifaceted approach to income generation on a farm. Later on, we're going to hear from my colleague David Stiles, who will look at scenarios into the future, and just taking one of the graphics from his work in terms of looking at forestry. In this work, they looked at what types of scenarios would deliver carbon neutrality by 2050. And of the 166 scenarios that achieved carbon neutrality, the mean land area required was 18% for forestry. We're at 11% now. And interestingly, this is almost exactly the same as what the Department of Agriculture produced in 2014 to Ковфord in terms of its own strategy, and that still remains government policy. The challenge now is because we've missed our targets in recent years. Instead of having to plant 14,500 hectares to deliver that target by 2050, we now need to plant 20,000. That is a big ask. This is a graphic of the targets in straight lines over time, going back to the Programme for Economic Recovery in the 50s, right up to the current Climate Action Plan. And the jagged line are the number of hectares planted. And we kind of followed the targets. We were pretty close to targets over the 60s and 70s, 50s and 60s. We overachieved in the 90s, and we fell back later. But our targets fell with the decline in the numbers we were planting. But our goal has to remain the same. If we don't deliver forestry in terms of that 18%, we'll have to find other ways to reduce the emissions. We were in a similar position in the 70s when we joined the EEC, when there was a higher return from agriculture and the planting rate fell. And Frank Convery, who was a professor in UCD, wrote a very important report, the 1979 NEST report, which had a very detailed and multifaceted strategy, focusing on not just financial incentives, but financial, behavioral, organizational. And that led, because we implemented many of the details of that report, to a very significant recovery and an overachievement of targets delivered by the Department of Agriculture in the 90s. So I guess the lesson from that is we had a challenge before, we found solutions, and we delivered. And I guess we're in that position again, but at least we have the confidence that we were able to deliver in the past. In preparing this work, we also looked at the Food Harvest 2020 strategy, where, if you remember from the previous presentation, we over-delivered on beef and milk, and we missed our targets in forestry. Since 2011, that lowest point, the number of cattle increased by 865,000. It's actually gone up more in the most recent numbers. So that's equivalent to about 386,000 livestock units. Every hectare of forestry sequesters the carbon emissions from 3.8 livestock units. That means that it would take 102,000 hectares of forestry to mitigate the emissions from dairy expansion. However, we missed the planting target by 112,000 hectares in that period. So the conclusion is, if we had met the target, we could have had carbon neutral dairy expansion over that period. That's an important lesson. If we project out our carbon numbers, because we increased our forestry, our planting rates fell, and that high-level planting will be harvested in the next decade or so, we know that we will have what's known as a carbon cliff. As we harvest, our emissions will reduce, will increase, our sequestration will fall, and we'll have something like this, that flow of carbon over time. We can't control that. That's already happening. But what we can control is the depth of that cliff. And the more we can plant now, the lower that cliff will be. And the more likely it is we can hit those 2050 targets. If we delay implementing that forestry strategy, it will seriously impact our capacity to deliver carbon neutrality by 2050. Carbon is a challenge. The carbon neutrality is a challenge. But at least in forestry, it presents an opportunity. The state places a value on carbon. We see that when carbon taxes are applied, when we fill our cars or heat our homes. We place a value on the emissions we produce. In the same way, you can argue that that value is the value of the carbon we save when we sequester carbon in trees. At the moment, it's about €40. That would rise to €265 in 2050. So it's a very valuable resource, the carbon that we sequester in trees. When we look at the percentage of farmers that would be better off planting forestry, when you value the carbon, we call it the social return. We see that at €32 a tonne, it increases across all sectors, but at €100 per tonne, the value in 2030, that in most sectors, the return from private, so market and carbon value, is higher for forestry than most other sectors. It effectively means a radical change to the economics of forestry versus agriculture if you can find a way to factor that carbon value in. If we look at the agriculture support structures, grants, premiums, tax relief, on the current scheme, that's worth about €32 per tonne, which is a 2020 carbon price. In the recently announced programme last week, and this is for Sitka with a bit of biodiversity, it's €48 per tonne, and both of those are for yield class 2022, which is a 2023 carbon price. So that's a welcome improvement. But as that carbon price, which is a Department of Public Expenditure Reform price, rises up to €265 per tonne, there are very significant opportunities to further incentivise afforestation that yield a positive cost-benefit return. Final two slides about strategy. We need both short-term carbon sequestration delivered by fast-growing conifers. We need that because it can deliver carbon quickly, and we also need the timber from those trees to decarbonize the construction sector. But we also need broadleaves. We know that in the long run, they can sequester carbon. They do a bit more slowly, but they can be good carbon sinks, and they're probably better, they are better for biodiversity and better for recreation. So we need both. It's hard to get all objectives from one forest. We need to plan for different types of forests. We also need to think beyond just purely carbon. We need to think of carbon, water, biodiversity, recreation. We need to think about multiple benefits. And to enable this to happen, because it's a substantial change, both for landowners and for communities, we need to focus on, firstly, their concerns, and then to think about the behavioral changes required for people to make this decision, because we need a lot of forestry over the next 30 years to deliver on our goals. And we need to communicate it better in plain English. So my final slide are some of the other recommendations. I focused on carbon incentives, on behavior. We need to focus strategically. We need a land use strategy. We have lots of aims for our land, but many are in conflict. We don't have a way to prioritize at the moment. We need to focus on behavior. So things like dealing with licensing, which is improving an awful lot in fairness to the department. We need to integrate forestry and agriculture when we plan CAP and not treat them as separate sectors. And also we need to change our business model. Business as usual won't deliver the gains, or it will be very difficult to deliver the gains. We need to go back to the Convery report and think, what do we do right to get those changes in the 90s? We need to implement the McKinnon report, which has detailed regulatory aspects. I think a lot of people are calling, myself included, for a forestry development agency. There's a difference between forestry development and regulation, different risk profile. And also, while agriculture and farmers will deliver a proportion of afforestation, we need to think broader than that and multiple actors. And so when we need to deliver forestry from different sources for different purposes beyond purely timber, we may want to consider where is best to headquarter or centre forestry in government. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Cathal. Now, before we go on to our final presentation, let's take a look at the last poll that we put to you. We'll take a look at the final results. We asked you to rank, in order of importance, the priorities for meeting climate neutrality. There were 10. Let's take a look at the top. We've got 5 on the page. So let's take a look at the top 5 in order of importance, how you, the audience, ranked them. Number 1 was planting new native forests. Number 2 was implementing technical mitigation options. Number 3, in order of importance for meeting climate neutrality, was moving towards a more diversified mixed farming systems and alternative livestock mix. Number 4, re-wetting organic soils. Number 5 was diversify the use of grass as a bioeconomy feedstock. Let's scroll up actually to take a look at number 6. Number 6 in order of importance of the 10 was to expand high nature value grassland management. So there you go, that's how you, the audience, ranked our, in order of importance, the priorities for meeting climate neutrality. We have 2 final polls for today, so we'll go through them now. We have the next question that we are going to put to you. Again, it's a statement that we are asking you to consider. Strategic, long-term decision-making requires a reimagining of what a climate-neutral, resilient AFLU sector could look like. Of course, that's agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. So strategic, long-term decision-making requires a reimagining of what a climate-neutral, resilient AFLU sector could look like. Do you strongly agree? Do you somewhat agree? Do you somewhat disagree, or do you strongly disagree? So there you go. Nobody disagrees in any way with that statement. In fact, 71% of you, just 70% of you strongly agree with it, and the rest of you somewhat agree with it. That is, strategic long-term decision-making requires a reimagining of what a climate-neutral, resilient AFLU sector could look like. So it looks like you've more or less finished voting in that poll. So I think we could move on to the final poll, today's event. And we are asking you a question. Who should be the most responsible for driving climate action in 𝗲𝗂, agriculture, forestry, other land uses? Who should be most responsible for driving climate action? So choose one, please. Would it be farmers? Would it be food processors, retailers, consumers, investors, or policymakers? So we're asking you to choose one for who should bear most responsibility for driving climate action in 𝗲𝗂. Again, we'll give you a little bit of time to vote on that, but we're asking you to choose who you think should be most responsible. So select one from the list of farmers, food processors, retailers, consumers, investors, and policymakers. And at the moment, 3/4 of you think policymakers should be most responsible, followed by farmers, consumers at the moment. Farmers and consumers are neck and neck, then investors and food processors. So there you go. Policymakers, according to you, our audience, should be most responsible for driving climate action. And again, a reminder that all of these poll results will be available in the report that will be put up on the website. And we do thank you all for taking the time to vote in these polls. But now for the final presentation of the day on climate neutrality, I'd like to introduce Dr. David Stiles. David is Associate Professor in Agri-Sustainability in the School of Biological and Chemical Sciences, Ryan Institute in the University of Galway. David.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Helen, and thanks very much to everybody in the RDS for hosting this workshop, which is an opportunity for us to summarise some of the conclusions from the SeQUEsTER project, which is coming to an end. So it's a project that was funded by the EPA and by the Department of Agriculture, and it involves a really diverse team, if you like, who have done a huge amount of work. So I'm really grateful to the whole team for producing really nice results in this project. We're going to go through very quickly some of the summaries, and there are some other pre-recorded lectures which will be available online, or presentations online, which you can come back and look at in the future. So this is just an attempt to quickly summarize the key results from the project. We look firstly at where we are, the modeling that we did, how we define climate neutrality, how we sustain that neutrality, the uncertainties that we have, and the conclusions that we can draw despite those uncertainties. So firstly, we know we have a huge challenge in the agriculture and land use sector because we've got a very productive and relatively efficient bovine sector producing milk and beef. Lots of emissions with that though, lots of methane, lots of soil nitrous oxide. But in addition to that, we have a land sector which is also a source of emissions, not a sink. And that's largely because of very large areas of drained organic soils contributing almost 10 million tons of CO2 annually to our budget. We've got very small sink into mineral grassland soils, and we've got a very small sink soon to turn into a source from forestry because of the age profile of that forestry and because some of it's planted on organic soils. So essentially, we have a very big emission balance from the 𝗲𝗂 sector at the moment, 25 million tons of CO2 equivalent. Ultimately, we have to get that down to zero, and at the moment, we're going in the wrong direction. So it's a really big challenge that we have. In terms of how we approach this then, it's clear we were on the wrong trajectory. So when we started off the project, we had to consider how we ever going to think about what it could look like to be climate neutral. And we decided we had to take this backcasting approach. So a lot of thanks goes to 𝗲𝗵𝗵𝗁, who is the modeler that started the work on what we call the Goblin model, which is the general overview for a backcasting approach of livestock intensification and land use. And the purpose of that model was really to reimagine the different configurations that are possible in the land sector and the agriculture sector by 2050. So rather than work forwards from a bad situation, we look at where we need to get to and what that future could look like, because that's what we have to get to tackle the climate emergency. So that's the idea behind the backcasting modeling. And 𝗂𝗵𝗵𝗁 took over from Remy when Remy went back to France to a permanent job in 𝗬𝗏. So very grateful for the huge amount of modeling effort that's gone into this project, and Colm and 𝗀𝗶𝗺𝗵 have made some presentations online that you can look at some of the technical details of how we get to neutrality using this model. So I won't go too much into it, but the point is here that we have this model that reconfigures the land use sector in in a randomized way. So we can think about different combinations of milk production, beef production, forestry, soil rewetting, extensification of grasslands, maintaining grassland without cattle, etc. All of those things can be introduced into the model to see which of those combinations gets us to climate neutrality in the future. And that model has been published in Geoscientific Model Development. Another important issue that came up, which we thought was more resolved when we started the project, but in fact wasn't at all, is how we account for climate neutrality, how we define climate neutrality. So 𝗲𝗏 has a presentation on this, pre-recorded, and really, at the moment in our inventory reports, we aggregate all the greenhouse gases according to their 100-year warming potentials. So that's the 𝗲𝗏-100, and methane, nitrous oxide are all related to CO2 equivalents, and that's the way we account for things at the moment. Moving forward, many of the scenarios that have been developed for global climate stabilization, they do treat methane differently. We know we need to massively reduce methane, but we don't need to get to zero. And globally, we know we have to have a reduction of between 25 to 50% in methane emissions to get to climate stabilization. And we need to get the other gases, the CO2 and N2O, to balance to net zero. So that's another definition of climate neutrality apart from the 𝗲𝗏-100. A zero balance there indicates that you've got to offset all of your methane emissions with CO2 sinks. But if we have a separate target for methane emissions, we still have to meet that target, but it does mean that we only have to balance the CO2 and the N2O, so it's a fundamentally different balance that we need to achieve. Still difficult, but a bit more manageable. But we still face choices, even with all these different definitions, and this is just a graph that's taken out of the presentation that 𝗲𝗏 presented. And it shows that if we have different definitions, we do have different amounts of milk and beef production that are possible in that climate neutral future. So if you look at these graphs, the top right-hand corner is today's milk production and today's beef production. Anything to the left of that, in terms of all the scatters there, are points with lower dairy production, lower milk production. Anything below that line is something with a lower beef output. So we can see that everything, almost all of those graphs have climate neutral successful scenario scatters or points which are somewhat down and somewhat left of the point on the top right. And that means we have to reduce milk and we have to reduce beef output in order to get to that climate neutrality. The only exception is a very weak definition of carbon neutrality that doesn't account for nitrous oxide or methane. It's really not a likely viable definition, but it's there, and there you see a full scatter. The point is that we have choices to make. We can maintain milk production in some scenarios, but we have to reduce beef production. We can maintain beef production in some scenarios, but we have to reduce milk production. There's no easy way to get to neutrality without reducing the number of cattle. That's very clear from the work that we've done, and that's almost irrespective of which definition that we choose, or that might be internationally accepted, I should say, in the future. So what does this look like? It's quite hard to visualize what those changes mean. And in some of the recent work, we've tried to visualize what those land uses could look like. And 𝗲𝗏 produced these graphs, which show that we have the current situation on the left, where we've got 58% grassland cover. We've got about 11% forestry cover, 17% wetland, etc. If we move to a 𝗲𝗏-100 definition of climate neutrality, where we try to maximize milk output, we have to massively increase our forest cover to 32% of land use. And that would really represent a huge planting rate of 35,000 hectares per year. If, however, we have a separate target for methane, that's the third graph in, ch4 target grandparenting, it's more achievable. With a 20% forestry cover, we can actually achieve climate neutrality with very high milk output if we manage to plant 20,000 hectares of trees every year from now, or from 2025 until 2050. Furthermore, we know that we could introduce some further abatements, and if we were very ambitious with abatements and get a 30% decoupling of emissions from production, we could probably maintain current milk production with a 20,000 hectare per year afforestation rate, with much, much lower beef production, almost no suckler herd. But there is a pathway there, if you like, to climate neutrality that's achievable. And there are many different flavors. These are just some examples of the choices that we're going to have to make to get to climate neutrality. So the other challenge, very difficult to get there, but it's actually even more difficult to stay there. And one of the challenges we didn't anticipate at the beginning, we're obviously relying very heavily on new tree planting to get those carbon sinks in place. As Carl described in his presentation, trees can only be planted at a certain rate, but they also reach a saturation point over time. And if we stop planting in 2050, we'll get to a point in time towards the end of the century where we have another carbon cliff and we don't sustain climate neutrality through to the end of the century, which we obviously need to do to meet our Paris commitment. So we need to think carefully about this. Firstly, we do need to start planting very soon in order to get to our 2050 target, because we're limited in the rate of planting and the amount of sequestration that can be done. But we also need to think how we're going to maintain that sink into the future. And that's really where the role of commercial forestry can be particularly important, because from other work we've done on other projects, we can see that a lot of the long-term climate mitigation that can be achieved by forestry happens downstream after we harvest the wood. And this is particularly the case if we can be smart about wood use in the future, and we can cascade that use down through high-value uses first, putting it into buildings. Solutions like engineered timber mean that we can upgrade relatively low-quality wood from fast-growing trees in Ireland into really good quality building products that can build multi-story, even 20-story plus buildings. That's a possibility. We can even use that wood after it's come out of those buildings in lower grade products, and eventually we can put that wood in the distant future, potentially 50 or 100 years from now, into technology like bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And this is the kind of technology that we think we're almost certainly going to have to get to work in order to sustain climate neutrality into the future. The key thing about forestry is that it buys us a lot of time to get that technology working. It buys us at least the time that the trees are in the ground, but probably time beyond that, the time that the wood is in different products after we harvest those trees. So that's potentially a pathway that commercial forestry could deliver us very long-term climate neutrality. Now, we do have lots of uncertainties. I've been through the uncertainties about how we account for methane. We know in all cases we need to reduce methane a lot, and we need to do a lot to reduce CO2 and offset nitrous oxide. Soil carbon sequestration is somewhat uncertain, but in the long term, that's not going to be a long-term sink, because we are going to reach saturation. Organic soil emissions are uncertain, but irrespective of that uncertainty, we have to get them as close to zero as possible to get to climate neutrality. So the actions are quite similar. Hedgerows and isolated trees are not counted for in the current inventory, but they're unlikely to have a big increment in terms of year-on-year growth, because they're often kept to a similar size. So the point here, we do have a lot of uncertainties. We definitely need better accounting, but those uncertainties do not undermine the core messages about the key actions that we need to take to get to climate neutrality. There is very clear certainty about the actions that we have to take. So the 𝗹𝗂𝗶 flux is slow to respond to management changes, especially when we talk about planting new forests. Reaching net zero is going to take decades of action, but we really need to start now to get those sinks in place to have a chance of meeting climate neutrality by 2050. There is significant uncertainty also about the definition of climate neutrality, but it definitely does not undermine the direction of travel, which we know is very clear. We're going to need modest destocking. We're going to need very ambitious abatement across the cattle sector. We're going to need extensive re-wetting of organic soils, and we're going to need at least 500,000 hectares of new forest by 2050 to have a chance of getting to climate neutrality. In general, this aligns with bioeconomy objectives, with biodiversity objectives, and with water and air quality objectives. It's also likely to be driven by future carbon pricing and market signals, but we need to get some of that action happening now, and that's where there's a role for government to step in. And really, there's a very strong need to link land use policies with downstream construction, energy, and industrial policies, so that we know there's going to be a demand for that timber. That huge amount of wood that we're going to need to produce to sequester carbon in the short term is going to be an opportunity to expand the bioeconomy in the long term. But we need to know that those industries are going to develop to be available to take that wood longer term. So we really need long-term, forward-looking and integrated vision, and that's going to take really resolute leadership. There's no easy way out of this, but there are pathways. We need to make difficult decisions, but more than anything, farmers need a clear vision to give them confidence to make those changes that we're going to ask them to make. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and thanks very much for tuning in.
Thank you very much. David, you're going to stay with us and join us for a quick chat. And as David said, all questions are welcome. We will ask everybody taking part. If you have any questions for David, you can put them to us through Slido. We will do our best to get through as many of them as possible. So start putting your questions in, please. David, a lot of the focus at the moment is on 2030, which is really only 7 years away. You're taking, I suppose, a much longer view of things, and for you, 2050 is what we should be focused on.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously need to get to some intermediate targets, but for us, we had a very clear focus on 2050 because we were looking at that very ambitious target of climate neutrality. To us, that makes a lot of sense because some actions are going to take a long time to bear fruit and to start to achieve some of those offsets and those sinks that we need to get in place in the land use sector. So it is going to take decades to turn that around and to get significant sinks in place. So I think 2050 is a realistic time horizon for a lot of those actions. It's not to undermine the intermediate targets we're going to need, but certainly from the land use side of things, when we talk about forestry, there's not much we can do in 7 years for sinks. But
it doesn't mean we can take our foot off the pedal. We do need to start acting now to reach the 2050 targets.
Absolutely, and that's the difficulty. So even though we might not see the fruit of that action, if we don't start taking that action right now or as soon as possible, we simply will delay that further down the road, the effects further down the road, so that we won't get the sinks in place. We won't be able to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. So the planting, that really needs to start now because that's very time limited.
And I see questions coming in. There's just one other thing I want to put to you before that, and it was something that came up in Mary's presentation as well. There's a lot of talk about either conifers, which are commercial crop, or native woodland. In Mary's presentation, it said a bit of both. What do you think?
No, absolutely. I think that's a good point, that we definitely need a mix of both because we are going to have to deliver biodiversity as well as carbon sinks. I think we could see from the results I was presenting there that commercial forestry has a particular role to play where we can envision a very long-term sink of carbon into the future, and that can also support a bioeconomy. So there's a very important role for that in terms of maintaining a climate neutral economy into the future. But we probably need the biodiversity benefits of native woodland as well. We do need them as well. And many of the scenarios we modeled to get to climate neutrality did involve a mix up to 50-50 of each type of forestry.
Okay, and as you said, it's important then if we do have the commercial crop that there's a market, there's an outlet for the commercial crop.
Absolutely, yeah. So we need those industries to be developed simultaneously to expand in the forestry supply.
Okay, we have got some questions coming in. There's one here that I'll put to you, and again, it's to look at the dairy herd. Do we favour a selective reduction of the dairy herd since it's the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases? Do we reduce back to quota restriction removal?
Yeah, well, these are policy choices. So I think one of the arguments in favour of milk production is it's more profitable. If we look at things like the 𝗰𝗵𝗁 diet, for example, we see there's an important role for dairy products in that diet, and we need to consume less meat to have a kind of planetary sustainable diet. That would imply that maybe dairy production should be prioritised and beef and sheep production given less priority in the future climate neutral space. But that's not really for us to decide. We can show what combinations are possible, and I think the next job now is for policymakers to engage with the sector and the possibilities of climate neutrality to see which flavour, if you like, of those definitions is more palatable and more attractive.
I did notice in your presentation you said that there's no easy way of doing it without reducing the number of cattle, but it is possible. So what's the tough way of doing it without reducing the number of animals?
It seems that there is no way of doing it without reducing animals somewhat. So we have a choice about which animals to reduce. And I think the more action that we take sooner on things like getting trees in the ground, on re-wetting organic soils, and on really ambitious abatements, the more we can mitigate that reduction in animal numbers, the smaller that reduction needs to be. But it looks like from what we've looked at, it's almost inconceivable that we can get to climate neutrality without reducing cattle numbers.
Okay. Another question has come in. Can climate-smart agriculture deliver a fair share of emission reductions relative to the sector's overall greenhouse gas output, either domestically or at EU level?
So climate-smart agriculture is kind of a catch-all phrase. It's going to be very important, and I think there are a lot of technologies that we are going to be throwing at agriculture, and 𝗀𝗃 are doing really good, strong work, and they're showing leadership here about how to reduce emissions intensity, how to implement abated urea, low emission slurry spreading. It looks like we're going to have some additives that we can put in feed to reduce methane emissions. Those are all really important things, and they're going to have to be done. The more we can do that, the smaller the animal herd reduction is going to need to be, but we can't do that in isolation. We're never going to get to neutrality without that big sink being put in place, and that really requires ambitious action in the land sector, the re-wetting of organic soils and the afforestation.
You mentioned the accounting and that it's not perfect, and it's something that was mentioned here, that have you considered hedgerows as a sink? And it's something that a lot of farmers do ask, that hedgerows, are they not counted? Now, I know it's a stable number, as you were saying, it doesn't change much.
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge, that they're an important store of carbon, much like grassland soils are a really huge store of carbon. But if that store isn't changing, if it's not increasing, then it's not a year-on-year sink, which is what we need to offset emissions. And that's where the challenge is, conveying some of those messages that we do need to get that ongoing sink. That's where things are a little bit difficult. Now, hedgerows are really valuable for lots of other reasons, for biodiversity purposes, and farmers should absolutely be rewarded for maintaining hedgerows and keeping that biodiversity in place and not releasing that carbon by removing them. But the reality is that they're not going to be a big sink in our accounts, and they will be a modest sink by the look of it, but not a big sink.
Okay, okay. Another question, and the questions are flying, and we'll ask you to keep sending the questions in. We're doing our best to get through as many of them as possible. Without increased supports for the very extensive low-income sheep and beef sectors, would it lead to a massive transfer of land to intensive dairy?
Well, I don't think we can allow that to happen if we want to meet our climate neutrality targets, because we simply can't have lots more animals, and we can't have lots more dairy production. And dairy animals are higher emitting per head than beef and sheep. So we simply can't have a big expansion of dairy if we want to get to climate neutrality. So that's not really an option. But what is an option is that we convert that very low profitability land, because sometimes farmers are farming land but not actually making much money on the animals themselves. In those cases, I think, as Cathal shows, there are many examples where converting to forestry could be more economically attractive for farmers, and that's what we need to encourage, because that is going to be part of the solution to get to climate neutrality. And it's going to enable other farms, like successful dairy farms, to maintain their production, to keep doing what they do, and also to be able to market products internationally. We need to be able to show that we're meeting our targets. If we can do that, we can maintain that green marketing of sustainable produce internationally. If we don't meet our targets, I don't think it's going to be possible to maintain that green marketing.
We touched on earlier, I suppose, a bit of both native woodlands and commercial forestry, but there's a question here, is one better than the other? Between now and 2050, will new commercial forests or new native woodlands sequester carbon quicker?
Well, there's no question that commercial forests will probably do it quicker, because they tend to be faster growing tree species. Irrespective of how we use the wood afterwards, they are much faster growing.
Okay, but the biodiversity is the big difference.
But they don't have the biodiversity, so that's a trade-off, if you like. So that's why we need the mix.
Another question has come in. How can the RDS support Irish missions, particularly in African countries, to integrate carbon neutrality into agri-food programmes?
It's a good question, probably beyond my knowledge of how the RDS and the climate smart agriculture part of it works. But I think this is actually quite important, though. Behind this question, I think if we want to feed the world sustainably in the future, there are limits on how much we can produce as a country whilst meeting our climate neutrality targets. The logic is that there are many countries of the world that do produce milk and beef less efficiently, where populations do need more milk and meat in their diet, and those are the places that we need to focus on to improve efficiency, to sustainably intensify. There's only so much further we can do that in Ireland. We have to recognise how much we can produce sustainably, probably a bit lower than where we are now, and we need to make sure other countries are able to produce their food sustainably. That's the future, if you like, for food security and climate neutrality for everybody.
The one, I suppose, takeaway for me from today is the importance of forestry and planting trees, and starting yesterday. And one thing that I thought was interesting in Mary's presentation was it was said that a carbon neutral dairy expansion would have been possible at some stage had we been planting enough trees.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the way we look at it going forward, I think, as well. That there is a pathway to make that production, and it could be from the dairy sector, climate neutral. If we get very ambitious about a tree planting, we are going to have to be climate neutral, and that will enable us to market climate neutral produce, if you like, from the agri-food sector. But as it stands, we're a very long way away from that. So that the tree planting is part of a package of being able to produce food sustainably and market that food sustainably abroad.
There's a positive enough message from today, I suppose, if we can sum it up, David. I mean, you know, 7 years is one thing, but between now and 2050, there is a lot we can do.
Absolutely, yeah. We've got 28 years to get there, and we do need to reimagine what it looks like. But I think, as Cathal showed, the sector has changed a lot through time, and often it's changed in response to policy levers. And so there is farmers will have to do a lot of work, and sometimes I think farmers feel unfairly kind of vilified for the fact that the sector is a big emitter. But farmers are absolutely 100% part of the solution, and I think the ball is largely in the policymakers' court to design those policies to incentivize farmers to take those actions that we as a society need them to take to get us to climate neutrality. It's a collective action, and it's not just the agriculture sector. We need to do it across all sectors of the economy, but that also creates opportunities. We need more wood for construction. We need more biomaterials. We need more biodiversity and carbon sinks to be in place. So that's just something we're going to have to pay farmers to do. It's a diversification, but there are opportunities there as well.
That's great, and it's a good note to leave it on. Thank you very much, David. And thank you all for taking part in today's event. We do appreciate you answering all of those many polls we put to you and for putting the questions to David. All of the results of the questions we asked you will be compiled, and a summary of it will be available on the website. A full report of today's event, as well as some of the pre-recorded presentations, will be available too. But I'd like to thank all of today's speakers for all of their fascinating presentations. I'd like to thank you all for taking part, and enjoy the rest of your day.